Welcome to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome's first presentation for 2023. It's the 128th in our Zoom series. My name is Rick Carpenter, and as today's host, it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Phil Helwig. With over a half-century of experience in design and technical management of projects involving hydropower and water resources, Phil is well qualified to offer us a comparison of the attributes of hydro, wind, and solar energy resources. Phil formed his own company, Helwig Hydrotechnique Limited, some 2 decades ago with involvement in projects in Canada and abroad. Today, Phil is speaking to us from Cambridge, England. Following his presentation, we'll take questions from the audience in the order they appear in the Zoom chat function. Phil, the floor is yours.
From Cambridge, England, where I am located right now. I believe this may be a first for KCOR. Hope it works well. The title of my talk is Comparison of Renewables, Hydro, Wind, and Solar. I will be discussing my presentation under the following 7 headings. The purpose of this talk is to discuss and compare the attributes of hydro, wind, and solar renewables, and also to challenge the notion that hydro is not sustainable. There's just one technical point I'd like to introduce at the beginning. I want to explain the meaning of capacity and energy by analogy to this tanker truck. The capacity is the horsepower or kilowatts, if you prefer. Basically, as you would experience on the level flooring the accelerator, or the nominal value stated by the manufacturer. Energy is represented by the amount of fuel in the truck. And it's similar in a hydro plant to the amount of water in the reservoirs. The capacity factor would be the average power per year. That represents the average energy, the energy produced in terms of a power parameter over the rated power. It represents the percentage of power used over the potential maximum. We'll start by looking at the features of hydropower developments. They depend very much on the hydrologic regime, cited often at topographical anomalies. They may involve multi-purpose developments and run-of-river or large-scale storage developments. So we'll take a picturesque tour of some of these ideas. But first, we have a look at the power equation. Approximation that you might like to remember is that power from a hydro site can be estimated approximately by 8.4 times the head in meters times the flow in cubic meters per second. It's proportional to the product HQ. Let's start off in Ecuador. This is a reconnaissance visit for a potential small hydro development. Ecuador is on the equator. We're actually maybe 100 miles south of the equator here. There are basically 2 seasons in this area, wet and wetter. Now we head up to the Northwest Territories. This, I think, is a picture from 1994, temperature minus 41 degrees below zero. This basin is in the arid zone. There's scarcely 10 inches of runoff per year from snowmelt and rainfall. Back to Newfoundland, this site is a canyon site. The river is restricted to a very narrow canyon. It's almost possible to reach from side to side at the bottom. Not quite. You need to have arms that are maybe 5 feet long. We were able to develop this site with a very small, efficient concrete gravity dam, one of the few you'll ever see in Canada. Taking a leap to another area famous for hydro developments, the country of Nepal. This development, the Kaligandaki, benefits from a short circuit around a long bend in the river. This power plant exploits the difference in head between the intake and about 60 kilometers of drop along the river to be a couple hundred meters. And it's largest power plant in Nepal at this time, as far as I know. Now to Alberta, the St. Mary's River Irrigation District, where my son works, an example of a multi-purpose scheme. This plant utilizes a drop in the canal where I think 100 feet, somewhere in the order of 30 meters of head is available. It's sufficient to generate almost 12 megawatts. It operates using the water flow provided to farmers. Therefore, it only functions during the period of year when water is required for agriculture. It's shut down most of the winter and spring, allowing some storage to build up in the reservoirs upstream. This is a project in Malaysia. It's a fairly big project on the upper reaches of the Perak River, not all that far from Thailand, for those who are familiar with the geography of that area. The spillway is designed in such a manner as to route flood peaks through the system and reduce the peak flow thereby. This will be beneficial to communities downstream and for the design of 2 other hydro plants on the lower reaches of the river. It's interesting to see the importance of storage in hydro developments. So I've made this classification based on the storage ratio. It's a live storage volume in the reservoir of these different plants over the mean annual flow volume. So it's a volumetric ratio. For daily pondage, this is a small project in Quebec, been in operation, I guess, for a decade or so. I was involved in a pre-feasibility estimate for it. This plant with a very small head pond reservoir can provide peaking for 4 hours at the driest time of year. Right? That is 4 hours of peaking and 0 production for 20 hours. A small reservoir in the classification between 5 to 20% was proposed for Portland Creek project that's taken through to a final feasibility study in Newfoundland, but never built. This reservoir is operated to maximize energy output and operates on the principle that when you have a storm, you fill up the reservoir. When the storm's over, you utilize the water as fast as you can. So the next storm, you have a capacity to capture the flow from the next storm. This project utilizes a very high % of flow, or would have if it had been built. Tarbella is one of the largest dams and one of the most important projects on the Indus River in Pakistan. And it provides mainly seasonal storage for irrigation, but is an important producer of electricity as well. Back on a smaller scale that I know much better, the Snare River in Northwest Territories likewise has a seasonal capacity in its reservoirs. Year to year, year over year, storage is not, firm flows are not always possible. Hines Lake was designed for multi-year regulation so that the plant could be operated at the firm plant, output for 3 years in the worst cycle we had in record. So it probably meant that it probably good for more than that. Similar for Cat Arm. LG2 has multi-year regulation as well. It has much bigger ratio. And of course, the granddaddy of them all in this department is Asquan Dam, which is said will pretty well run at average flow forever. So Mother Nature would have a word or two to say about that. I'd like to just list some of the benefits that hydro can supply. It provides complementary storage to firm up renewables such as wind and solar production, and we discuss a bit of that later. The units can be very quickly put into service in a matter of seconds, rarely more than a minute. You can put a hydro unit online, and this facilitates following peak load variations in the system. Hydro units tend to bring a lot of momentum, which aids in frequency stabilization so that your frequency doesn't stray very much from 60 cycles. I've noted the benefits of dispersed generation sources. This applies to all of the renewables we'll be discussing. This benefits from the fact that the weather and climate doesn't exactly conform from one part of a province to another. It may be a dry year in St. John's, but quite wet up in St. Anthony's. I'm now going to take up the idea of complementary storage. This is my wording for it, but it's fairly explicit. So I'll read, in systems with large storage reservoirs, such as Hydro-Quebec and Newfoundland systems, water can be temporarily stored when production from wind or solar generators is high. This stored water can be used later for energy production when wind and solar power is low, generally without spilling. This effectively firms up wind or solar energy, which is a significant benefit. It is the modus operandi which is used in Quebec and to encourage wind generation in Gaspé and some of the outlying areas of the province where the economic situations are not really that good. The challenges to hydro. Good sites are often at remote locations. That involves a lot of additional expense. Projects footprints tend to be quite large. The dams, reservoirs, access roads, power corridors, etc., can be very substantial, especially for large projects. Environmental effects are both positive and negative, and the notion that all environmental effects are going to be negative is something that I think needs to be challenged. Likewise, social and economic effects may be both positive and negative. These issues very much depend on site factors. Finally, the regime under which hydro plants are built and operated is very complex and expensive, less so for other renewables. Let's have a look at wind. Let's start with aspects of this that I recall from growing up in Jamaica. We have quite a few remnants of old sugar grinding mills. The masonry is still in place, but the machinery is all gone. We used to have such a mill on at my uncle's place, and it had been taken over by an owl and his and her family, and you could see the skeletons of rats and mice which littered the floor, indicating the diet these critters thrived on. In the southern part of Jamaica, in the leeward side, which is dry and savanna like conditions, you would see wind-driven pumping systems for cattle watering. So wind has a long history. The present technologies have evolved, involve two types of approaches. On the left, there's a vertical axis or egg beater windmill, which was developed and promoted by National Research Council, but hasn't had a checkered history. This one had severe damage from an event storm, I think in 1992, but it's been retained as sort of a large-scale artifact for visitors to capture in the Gaspé. On the right is a more familiar and more successful design of the horizontal axis turbine. They look all the same, whether they're in Ontario, Quebec, Britain, or Timbuktu. I thought it'd be interesting to have a quick look at the elements of the wind turbine. We look first at the wind vane. The wind vane provides information to the controller that allows the controller to put in motion this yaw drive to point the machine into the wind. The anemometer measures the velocity, and the controller takes that information to adjust the pitch in the system so that to rotate the blades and keep the speed of rotation about 13 RPM. That's a very slow rate, and to minimize the mass that has to be perched on top of a tower, a gearbox has been introduced into the circuit. This gear multiplies the speed by a factor of almost 100. So that 13 RPM is well over 1,000 RPM. So complex as mechanical equipment goes, but it's approved design that has been very well worked out. Note the wind power equation. These various factors can be reduced into a quite easy to remember equation, 0.123. No, 0.234, beg pardon. Note the effect of the velocity The velocity cubed means increase in wind speed has a very significant increase in power output. This is a wind farm somewhere in California, I guess. It's pinched off the wind internet like a lot of my illustrations are. The wind challenges, well, the intermittent availability of wind is an issue. The range of wind speeds constrain the spectrum of operation. Below 4 meters a second for wind speed, the friction in the system exceeds the energy imparted from the wind. At a cutout speed, the cutout speed is normally around 25 meters per second. Beyond that, you risk damaging the equipment. So at that point, the blades are feathered, and at some point the blades are feathered, and the machine is shut down. Minimum air temperature for conventional designs that are employed in Canada is minus 20 degrees centigrade. Lower temperature limits can be provided, but at extra cost, because special equipment and materials are required. Icing of blades has been an issue in some applications and in some sites in Canada. The Betz limit is an interesting result of looking at the dynamics. And what it says basically is that the maximum amount of energy that can be produced from the wind going through the blades is 59% or 16/27. This limits, this is a physical limitation that you can't design your way around. The best designs give an efficiency of 45%, which represent 80% of efficiency applied to the 80% of the Betz limit, which is pretty good. Wind and solar also have power quality issues. This means that when the power from these equipment, the windmill, it has a gusty behavior and integration into a power, and it perturbs the power system, and results in and risks of causing problems with speed. The specifications and designs require that rotation speed be about 60 RPM or 60 hertz, maybe plus or minus 0.5. And control of voltage is also an issue. Going to go back to history for a bit. The first person to discover the photovoltaic effect was Edmund Becquerel, and he was a young fellow, only 19 at the time, and the year was 1839. Albert Einstein was involved. His theory of light, so-called photon theory, provides a lot of background to the science behind the solar cell, and was a part of a package of accomplishments that won him the Nobel Prize in 1921. The Vanguard 1, which was launched by the Americans in 1958, depended solely and entirely on solar electricity generated from its 6 solar cells. It worked for 6 years in the extreme environment of space, which is really quite an amazing accomplishment. The difference, I think, between NASA's solar cells and what was used commercially is that cost wasn't an issue with them. It was your reliability and efficiency. We'll take a tour around this the picture here to describe the elements of a solar solar photovoltaic system. The essential element is the solar cell, which is typically, I think, about 12 inches by 9. It's fairly small. These cells are assembled in a module. The modules are then attached together to make a panel or a solar array. The solar array is generally direct face to due south wherever possible, or as close as that. And the elevation should be, depending on who you talk to, somewhere around the latitude of the site minus about 15 degrees. Some sources say that it should be tipped up at the latitude of the place, but it's not quite true. I saw this from the train in England. I looked out at the windows on a solar farm, and according to Wikipedia, they should have been perched up at 52 degrees. They certainly weren't. They were more like 52. They were around 30 something. On this side here, I bring your attention to basically 2 elements that are critical to the operation of the system: an inverter, which converts the direct current produced by the solar panels into alternating current for integration into the system, and batteries, which are employed to back up and firm up energy in some installations. The other peripherals are needed for management, but are fairly small and don't have much of a cost impact in the design of the system. The solar power equation can be reduced into something in the order of 160 times the area watts per meter squared. It's interesting to note that the solar energy intensity on a meter squared panel, if you wish, pointing perpendicular toward the sun, is about 1,000 watts per meter squared. And it is essentially constant regardless of the latitude of the site. So you get that amount of energy whether you're in Yellowknife or in Kinshasa. You'll see in England, among my neighbors, many rooftop projects like this, and there are several in Ottawa as well. Our neighbors in 2020 earned about £600 from their rooftop system. 21 was down to 400, and last year 2022 probably was a big year because it was so hot and in UK and presumably lots of sun, but I haven't been in touch with them to get the latest statistics. This is a facility near Lethbridge, Alberta. My son sent me a copy of it. It's to develop 39 megawatts. They have built a facility that occupies about 220 acres. It's a lot of land, a lot of real estate. What's interesting is to look at the evolution of the designs and the technologies, because each of these lines represents a different type of design. The designs based on silicon, the yellow monocrystal, which I've decided to highlight, is now advertised at 22% by information I have got in the UK. So it's also interesting to see the cost evolution. I tend to focus on the utility scale, but you've got roughly a 5-fold reduction. Take 2020 and divide it by 5. No, take 2010 and divide by 5, which is an extraordinary improvement in efficiency and economy. Let's look at the challenges that apply to solar developments. The angle of the sun, daylight hours, shadows, clouds, air temperature to some extent, dust and snow all impair the production. The conversion efficiency is quite low, typically around 19, but working its way up somewhere, I should probably say 19 to 22. Some projects have very big footprint, the picture I gave you. And I think very much that a more environmentally acceptable approach would be to site solar projects on top of large buildings. I'm thinking of box stores, Canadian Tire, and big buildings with flat roofs. This way, they don't occupy valuable agricultural land. They have the same power quality issues as wind. And I just noted they should be able to resist for wind and hail, and I do believe they've been built with those challenges in mind. I think it's interesting now to compare some of the aspects of renewables, both looking at characteristics which are common and those which are variable. We look on the my comparison basically looks at these three the items. The first of the characteristics, I'm looking at the resource itself. I note that all natural energy resources are inherently variable and dependent on weather, region, and site factors. That goes for everybody. The hydraulic regime governs what can be produced in small hydro, wind regime for wind projects, and the solar regime for solar voltaic projects. These types of projects mainly produce secondary energy, with little or no firm energy, unless there's a possibility of storage. Persistence is not something you often hear discussed, but if you look at perennial rivers, and this is a ratio from Newfoundland, a substantial, the low flows are still fairly large vis-a-vis the average flows. And this means that perennial rivers have the potential to produce power pretty well all the time. This is not true for wind or solar. When wind speeds are less than 4 meters a second, output is 0 for wind. And when it's dark at night, output from solar is likewise 0. The predictability of all three largely depends on the improvements in meteorology and weather forecasting. Oh, now what am I going to do? Let's see. Okay. The next comparison, I'm looking at the technologies as opposed to the resources. Maturity, first item, both hydro and wind energy technologies can be considered mature. For hydro, I note they're generally unaffected by weather, but vulnerable to waterborne sediment. This is an issue in the Himalayas, in India and Nepal, and in countries in South America and the lee of the Andes. Wind has the constraints of the cut-in and cut-out speeds and minimum operating temperatures. Solar, there's still potential for new science, new ideas, and new technologies. And I think that's amply demonstrated in the my discussion on solar power. They have potentially long life, a few moving parts. The durability of materials, I think, will control longevity. The availability as percent of time. With hydro, it's generally between 95 to 98%. 98% is claimed by some wind advocates, but I don't believe it. I believe the number is probably closer to 90. Whenever I go to traveling in the country and I see a wind farm, I count the number of windmills that are not operating. There's always about 10% of them that are idle for some reason or another. Solar will always operate when sunlight is available. The solar energy, the energy capture, as I prefer to call it, which is represented by the capacity factor, runs to 45 to 50% of average for run-of-river. Their capacity factors. With storage, the capacity factor can be 8%, 80% or more. In other words, practically all the water is used for generating energy. With wind, it's shown here as 22%, but it can go up to 40 or 42 in exceptional cases. Solar is more limited, generally 12 to 14%, nominally 13. The economics, this is where things become quite interesting. With hydro, some attempt has been made to standardize equipment design, but because each design, each turbine wheel is a function of head and flow, it's not proven very effective. Standard designs are available, but the standard products are not available in the market. So you may save on the design effort, but you don't save very much in the manufacturing effort. Civil works are unique at each site. Very few opportunities for economies or standard designs. and civil engineering works generally constitute the majority of capital costs for hydro developments, upwards to 80%. So the hydro tends to be subject to diseconomies of scale. Unit prices for the work items tend to be higher for small projects. And these days, quite a lot of interest in smaller hydro projects, especially in the world in which I've lived. Wind developments use standardized equipment and benefit from industry-wide economies of scale, because these items are manufactured in their hundreds and thousands, which gives an opportunity for reducing unit costs. The same can very much be said for solar, but I would add one element which I don't think is shown there. There are benefits from improving efficiencies, which I don't think apply to the more mature hydro and energy types of renewables. Oops. So, okay, here we go. This comparison is the latest I can get about costs. A friend of mine said, costs are everything, so you better say something about costs. So I'm just going to concentrate on the cost of energy, cost per kilowatt hour, and look at hydro, for example. The cost has increased in this 11-year period, and the rate of increase is almost exactly what you get from inflation. So there have been no improvements. When you look at solar, the improvements are spectacular. When you look at offshore wind, likewise. Onshore wind, I think is not something I see in Newfoundland's future, because we have plenty of good sites on land. And why go into the ocean and spend a lot of money on developing footings for wind towers? Oops. Yeah. Okay, here we go. I want to talk a little about storage, because the optimal use of renewables almost invariable need involves some consideration of storage. Not shown there, I should mention that the small hydro projects of the type that have been contemplated in Newfoundland and executed quite widely in British Columbia often can benefit from low-cost storage development from numerous lakes in the environment in the country, where raising the water level by maybe a meter or two provides significant improvements on water use. The complementary storage, I've already gone through that. It applies for using coupling systems with large reservoirs, and large in a relative sense. And the examples that I know best are Hydro-Quebec and Newfoundland Hydro and Newfoundland Power. We have two power companies. Pump storage, the classical pump storage is a pretty expensive solution for storage. It involves pumping water from a lower reservoir to an upper one in off-peak hours when power is available, and then draining that power from the upper reservoir back through the turbine generator to recover the energy. One idea which was suggested in Newfoundland, but I don't think carried out taken very far, involved using a windmill to pump water from Lake Michel in the long range mountains, lifting the water about 20 meters into the watershed of Cat Arm. And then the same water would be able to go through the turbines and benefit from a total head drop of 400 meters. The gross benefit, a factor of 20 minus the pumping effort, gives a factor of 19. But that idea has never taken flight, but it's out there. There are situations where this might be a good idea, and somebody will pick it up one of these days. A more conventional idea for firming up renewable energy, and solar and wind in particular, is to couple the generators with batteries. I haven't followed the evolution of battery design to any great extent. When I was with EMR in Ottawa some years ago, the expert in batteries more or less was of the opinion that the chemistry and physics of battery behavior had pretty well been completely developed. What I think's happened that can sort of gives a bit of a light to that opinion was that when you start looking at very large batteries, very large stationary batteries, which I think are now available up to power capacity of about 10 megawatts. There seem to be major improvements in efficiencies of scale. So this has made the battery element of the battery addition to renewables not so far-fetched as it used to be. Likewise, imagine if we had thousands of electric vehicles. They're parked most of the time, and if they could be used to store energy when the system has surplus, and provide energy when it's needed at peak times, there could be big advantages. So that's an idea. I haven't seen it in the literature, except a KCOR presentation I listened to last year elaborated on that in the most, I think, agreeable and beneficial way. So hooray for KCOR.
Phil, we've reached 50 minutes now, 50.
Yeah, well, I've got about 3 minutes left, so we'll just wrap it up if you don't mind.
Super.
So I wanted to talk about hydro sustainability, mainly because there's a lot of the dialogue and discussion about renewable energies has discounted hydro. And part of this is arguing that hydro isn't sustainable. Well, I claim that the main challenge to sustainability for hydro is the question of reservoir sedimentation. Now, imagine run-of-river projects with low dams and gates to flush sediment downstream. This type of design preserves reservoir capacity. Sedimentation isn't an issue. For projects located in areas with little soil cover, and features such as marshes, ponds, lakes, typical of the Canadian Shield. These features pretty well ensure that no sediment reaches the reservoirs. I would argue, therefore, that all hydro projects, that the assumption that all hydro projects are unsustainable is wrong. I think I leave the wrap-up issues as points for discussion that people may wish to pursue in that mode. And my presentation also lists a short list of major references that people might proceed. And I would like to have one last photo. This is related to the Canadian side of our family. Mackay, who is a cousin going back some ways, comes from this Isle of Egg in the Inner Hebrides. They get all their energy renewably. So I call them living the green dream. And that's enough for me for my presentation. I'm stand ready to respond to questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Phil. Most interesting to explore the interrelationships and the relative costs of these three different power sources. We've got 6 questions already, and I think we'll kick off with our first questioner, who is Art Hunter, and Peter McKinnon, you'll be on deck with the second question.
Okay, Phil, one of the things that struck me during your presentation is the unintended consequences of putting in hydro facilities. I mean, they might be positive, they might be negative, but during your long career in hydro dams, what are some of the unintended consequences that you've discovered?
Well, a good design attempts to deal with all the consequences. And we strive as engineers to do just that. What happens once in a while is issues that are, for which there are no clues or no history, sneak in and bite you in the bum, if you wish. One of the most notable of these issues is the question of mercury contamination in reservoirs. This, prior to about 1970, we didn't have, as a scientific community, equipment that could measure the presence of mercuries at very low concentrations. The development of that was about 1970, and some smart aleck in the US decided to test this equipment in reservoirs in South Carolina, and lo and behold, he discovered there seemed to be a problem with the creation of new reservoirs, and it influenced the percentage of mercury in the water column. But what was much more serious was this mercury is concentrated up the food chain. And that was another sort of surprise. The concentrations are so minor that they don't really matter. But when you go and look at what happens in the food chain, each tropic level in a way magnifies the concentration maybe by 100-fold. All of a sudden, the level of mercury becomes significant. And in many cases, the fact, let's say the parameter I I note is the concentration of mercury in the muscle tissue of large predator fish. And in some naturally occurring lakes, it's already above the Canadian standard of safety. But when, for many reservoirs, the effect is more significant, and it impacts indigenous people who are used to eating that as a food source. That said, it's a transient phenomenon, but you need a lot of patience, because it takes, depending, the data I've seen, from about probably 12 or 13 years to maybe 35 years for very large reservoirs, or some situations, for the situation to return to baseline.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Phil. Peter, I see you're back online, so we'll take your question now. John Meyer, you're on standby.
Thank you, Rick, and I appreciate your presentation, Phil, although I missed a few minutes of it due to internet connectivity. I posed a question which is a little out of the mainstream of your talk, but at the same time, it has to do with water. I'm just wondering if you might comment on the potential for commercial scale electricity generation from tidal power and open ocean bobbing, if you would. Thank you.
There's been a lot of thought and effort and investigation going into the tidal question. We've gone in Canada to the point of developing a small tidal station in Nova Scotia, around the idea of a special turbine design in which the generator and the turbine wheel are combined to minimize the amount of concrete that a powerhouse would contain. It works fine as far as I know, but the real problem is when the head available is very low, the economics really stink.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few tidal stations I know of that work. The French pioneered Larence, which has been in operation for 950 years, but it's kind of a big experiment. So I think, you know, the different types of concepts have been tried. The wave rider, something that kind of goes crickety crack as waves go by. A scheme in which waves crash into a sort of a container. Compressed air is generated and it blows out the top and turns the turbines. Just I guess the essential problem is the energy density is too small. You need a waterfall, or you need you know, strong light, or you need high winds to bring that energy density to the point where you can afford to extract it and produce something valuable.
Well, that's interesting in the tidal context. What about on the open ocean, where you have waves of varying heights, of course, but if you could have sensors that are built into some devices that basically bob, and you've got lots of them, then you've had the potential to generate a small amount of electricity per bob. But if you could aggregate it over hundreds or thousands of these bobs, like solar cells in effect, could we get commercial electricity?
I think it goes back to the energy density. Now, those bulbs could be made very simple and maybe fairly cheap. That might help. I've seen that concept explored by folks in the Buren Community College in Newfoundland. And the thing is, here I may get in trouble, but the academics come up with great ideas sometimes, but they can't sometimes make the jump between an idea and making it work commercially.
The engineering, yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And our next questioner will be John Meyer, and David Doherty, you'll be on deck.
Yeah, Phil, I very much liked your table that gave the costs of electricity generated by through various methods and the progression over time. My question is going to relate to energy return on energy investment, EROI, and any table such as you presented based on dollars. I find one fundamental problem with it, well, probably a number, but dollars are the commercial medium of exchange, but the dollars we use, the dollars used in most tables, I think, are based on product costs likely coming out of China, and those parts are likely made using coal. I don't think that's going to go on forever. And the question is, have you done studies, are you aware of studies that you like that have been done on the energy return on energy investment for hydro? My understanding is that the EROIs are very, very high for hydro, and certainly on a large scale. But have you looked at it from that point of view?
Like most folks know, I have, reflecting on that question in preparing for this talk. And I guess maybe a simplistic answer, it seems that, especially with solar, the cost of the elements are so low that, I don't think a lot of heat energy goes into producing them. Otherwise, the cost would be getting too high.
Okay.
Not a terribly rational answer, but I haven't done the arithmetic. So that's the kind of gut feeling. If it's cheap, it's probably not consuming a lot of exotic material, and it probably hasn't required a huge amount of energy to produce it.
Okay.
Thanks for
thanks
your-
very much. Yep.
Thank you, John. Our next question will come from David Doherty, and Susan Tanner, you're on deck, please.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering what you know about the solar cells that were announced last spring that can generate power at night.
I think that sounds like somebody's trying to pull your leg.
Well, they're using
don't believe
infrared,
it.
and they're using infrared instead of visible wavelength.
Well, talk about infrared. I used to benefit from solar heating when I lived in Nepal. There's a very successful little Nepalese company called, I think, Universal Solar Heating. They're exploiting the infrared spectrum. That's the heat spectrum. And in Nepal, at least, it gets quite cold in the evening. So I don't think you'll get much benefit from your infrared energy at night.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Next question from Susan Tanner, and it will be Peter Bolkowski on deck, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you very much. I had two short concerns. One was whether or not you had done any comparison of geothermal. And two, I'm a bit concerned in the longer term about the viability of a number of rivers because of climate change and global warming. So if you have any thoughts on either of those two, I'd be grateful.
Well, the first, when you say geothermal, it means to me utilizing the heat generated from geological sources. We're looking at geysers or geological sources of heat, generally speaking. And I have seen, though I didn't inspect closely, a project of that nature in Guatemala, I think 5 megawatts, wells drilled into a formation from which very hot water and steam was extracted and then used to turn a steam type generator. And I'm aware of a very interesting development in Kenya. They, I would assume, are the leading country in the world for exploiting this type of technology. Nobody, it's one of these things that doesn't get in the news, but it's quite interesting.
So you were thinking then more of larger projects rather than domestic things Art Hunter has in his backyard, or
well, to me, that's it's a feature of the heat pump idea. And whether you're dumping the heat or extracting the heat from the soil, as opposed to taking it out the atmosphere. But geothermal for me, I'm thinking geology. I'm thinking geysers, I'm thinking super hot water. And this, they're not super big, but we're talking megawatt scale as opposed to kilowatts.
opposed to domestic. I see what you mean. Okay. And the rivers.
Well, the studies I've seen, I haven't looked at this in great detail, but there have been studies done in Northwest Territories, for example, looking at potential impacts of climate change. And in Northwest Territories, the evidence is ambiguous. One problem says you're going to have more water, and the next model says you're going to have less. So I think that like a lot of climate change issues, I think that there are areas where there may be more water and there'll be areas where there'll be less. So I don't think we can yet make a statement that climate change is going to, in a global sense at least, drastically impact hydro generation.
Good question, Susan, for which thanks. I might just mention that the largest dam in the world is in Zimbabwe. And right now the water level is at about 1% of its potential capacity. And the result, of course, is that there is not enough electricity to power the usual clients all the time. At any rate, we've got Peter.
I was going to say, the
Yeah.
largest dam is right now is in Pakistan, and the next largest is in Alberta.
Well, then the third largest or fourth largest.
No, it's a question of wording. It's a very big dam.
It's a very big dam.
So let's leave it at that. Don't say it's the biggest dam in the world, because you're going to get in trouble with me.
Thank you very much. Okay. Peter Bulkowski, your question now, and David Doherty, you'll be on deck.
Bill, Peter Bulkowski here, an old chemist, over 40 years in the oil patch, mostly oil sands. So I'm old tech and whatever. I thank you for a very interesting and comparative talk. Yours is one of the first places that I've heard anyone referring to complementary storage. My understanding is, in effect, there has been complementary storage in operation, with Norway holding back water in its reservoirs while it takes wind-generated electricity from Denmark. And this, my understanding is, has been going on for a number of years. Do you have any data which shows how well that's worked, and what sort of economics, or do the governments sort of hide that?
I did meet a fellow who used to work with shipping and engineering, and he spent some time with the, I guess, the Department of Water Resources in Norway, doing a study. Sounded very interesting to me. So I asked him, please give me a copy of this. And he said yes, but he never did. So, but where there are good business reasons for cooperating, I think a lot of utilities and even transnational elements have decided to work together, because it's win-win. A lot of those situations, I think, are basically win-win situations, and why wouldn't you?
But it would be really nice to have an economics evaluation of that, which would have more potential for convincing governments like Ontario and Quebec to cooperate, wind and solar versus Quebec's hydro holdback and so on. But it's pretty arm waving at best at this point. So hopefully you'll dig some of that up somehow. You have better contacts than most of us.
Well, I'm a bit curious. That gets me into poking my nose into things that maybe are not conventional. But communications is a big issue, you know, and I kind of learned it the hard way. I started writing letters to the editor in the Evening Telegram in Newfoundland about Muskrat Falls and all the foolishness that entailed, and nobody paid any attention. Nobody reads the newspaper anymore, so writing letters to the editors is just a waste of time. You got to get on TV or somehow. I don't know. I think getting the news out and getting ideas is tricky. But you've got an organization there that's dedicated to it, and more power to you. And hopefully you'll be able to attract enough diversity. A fairly big crowd listening tonight, I think. And when I tried to rustle up some business for my last webinar on nice engineering, I could only get 4 people in the whole of Canada. So not that good as a businessman, I guess.
Well, I appreciate your talk very much, Phil, and thank you, and have yourself a good evening. Bye for now.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter. David Doherty, you'll be questioning next, and we have 2 more questions. John Legg, you'll be on deck, followed by John Hollins. We've got roughly 10 minutes to run. Over to you, David.
Great, thank you. Short question. How much methane and carbon dioxide are generated in reservoirs and over what time frames?
I cannot put actual numbers to it. What I do know from what I gather is, first of all, that methane is related to the deterioration of leafy elements in plants. And I would imagine that that process pretty well runs its course in 2 or 3 or 4 years. The woody lignous parts of trees can last almost forever. I recall, this is risky when I say I recall reading that when Amsterdam Harbor was being redeveloped, I guess in the late 50s, they extracted wooden piles that are 800 years old, and they're still in remarkably good condition. So, but that's kind of getting off the track. I think the amount of CO2 is related to the amount of leafy material and the extent of inundation. And while I haven't done the knowledge, for major projects, I think the downside represented by that is it's very minor compared to the upside in clean energy production, or mostly clean energy production, if you prefer.
Yeah, I suppose if one tried to calculate the amount of these gases that would be generated, say, by the burning of either coal or one of the other fossil fuels, it would be far greater than the amount of those gases that comes out of a reservoir that can generate an equal amount of power.
But that's that the process is transient. It's not going to, once the leafy material is rotted, it's rotted. It's not going to grow. It's not going to continue producing CO2. So it's in the small reservoirs I'm familiar with, and some of them are not that small. The amount of leafy material is not that necessarily that great. It's hard to know unless you dig, up in the NWT and Labrador, a lot of inundation is bare rock. It's an environment with a lot of bare rock and a lot of gravel and rather thin cover of soil and rather poor quality growth of plants and trees.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next questioner will be John Legg, followed by John Hollins. I see your hand up, John Hollins, but I don't find you in the chat function. So if you have a question, would you please come up on deck?
Thanks, Rick, and thanks for that excellent talk, Phil. My question has to do with Hydro-Quebec. I lived the first 20 years or so of my life in Quebec, and those large works up in James Bay and so on had an almost a romantic quality because of the, well, I guess unprecedented distances away. And so I've assumed, but could you please update me on this, that there is a sort of an expertise within Hydro-Quebec, or at least the engineering area of this aspect, that is long distance transmission of electricity. Is there some kind of a positive recognition of this expertise worldwide, and are they called upon to do this? Because Well, for that matter, am I completely out of date? Are those lines down, are they still some of the longest in the world?
Always tricky asking civil engineers electrical questions, but it seems to me that Hydro-Quebec has found, they're quite satisfied with the technology behind those high voltage AC systems. I think the super high voltage was developed either for Manicouagan or for Churchill Falls. And so if you wind the clock back, there hasn't been much in the way of changes for probably 40 or 50 years. In other areas, one doesn't have to go wholly that far. Go to Manitoba. They have used direct current transmission for their long hauls. And I think that's that DC technology is probably more widely employed. It also permits two different systems to be interconnected without being synchronized together, because you've got this direct current link. We have it, I think, between Quebec and New Brunswick. So you've got this DC current, and at the downstream end, it's synchronous with northern United States, and the other side, it's synchronous with Hydro-Quebec. So a neat solution. So I think the technology on these matters, some extent, have gone through the consulting community. And a very good friend of mine, I would class him as one of the worldwide experts in this matter, and he's been involved in AC and DC links all over the world. Now in retirement, Satish Sood is his name. And the technology may not have been developed in Canada, but it's certainly been used by Canadians to great effect and to great benefit. And I'm sure we have, as a country, played our role in developing tools for studying power system behavior and power system planning. I know when I was at Shawinigan Engineering, one of the first power planning, system planning models developed, and I think it was world first at the time. It's pretty antique now, kind of like me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And we will conclude today's questions in this part of the presentation with a question from John Hollins.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My chat box got locked on a single participant early in the meeting, and I still haven't been able to untangle it. So thank you for responding to my hand and perhaps a message from John Legg. Phil Helwig, thank you very much. I enjoyed that. I've been used to hearing about economies of scale for a lifetime, I think, without really stopping to think or probe what it is for true. In one of your slides, you noted diseconomies of scale for large hydro. Could you explore that just a little bit further for us?
Well, it's for small hydro. and let's see, I'm not sure I'm using the right word, but basically, because it's small hydro, if you're looking at the logistics to get it going and the work programs that are employed, you will probably find that getting those bulldozers up to some place in Newfoundland and using them for fairly small amount of cubic meters of dirt, of pushing dirt around, results in the unit cost of a cubic meter of earth being rather on the high side, as compared to Hydro-Quebec, where they have huge dams and huge fleets of equipment and they're going full tilt for months on end. So when we get small, we have these diseconomies of scale, and maybe we should be thinking small in a different way. Maybe some of those diseconomies of scale are because we really haven't given enough thought. Because I'm getting, you know, I hear from time to time, just BBC Channel 4, someone said small is beautiful, small is smart. And I think that certainly with the small hydro, which has been something I've been very interested in for decades, had some success in employing it, but not much. Small hydro doesn't have the sex appeal politically that big hydro does. And we pay quite dearly for that because small projects often don't create environmental problems and social problems as much as really big projects. So maybe thinking small also means thinking smart. And I'm not sure if we're really good in the thinking smart right now, but it's a challenge.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Phil. This is but a short presentation, a small presentation, but judging from the questions and the interest that you've generated, we've had a very high economy of scale from this. And I'm going to turn the meeting over now to Jean Doherty, who's the chairman of the chairperson of the board of directors of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. Jean.
Thank you, Rick. And Phil, it is my pleasure and my privilege actually to thank you on behalf of KCOR for this very comprehensive talk that you gave us. It's been really interesting to see this comparison between the different energy sources that people are blithely talking about. And sometimes you wonder whether or not it's just a whole bunch of people speaking through their hat. And it's nice to actually see some documentation and backup for some of the things we've been hearing. So again, thank you very, very much for this, this presentation that you've given us. I'd also like to say thank you to everybody here who has shown up for this, our first presentation for 2023. I would encourage you to go to our website, canadiancore.com, and look at the one part that says stay informed. You can sign up for getting information about this and other talks that have come through in the past. You can see this as it comes up on the website after the taping has been processed by our Zoom team. It will be posted on our website, and you will get a link to that particular talk as if you register for Stay Informed. You also will get all the information of new information that's being added to the website on a regular basis. So stay informed is a really good way to keep up with what's going on. Also, everyone here, if you're interested in becoming a member of KCOR, becoming more involved in some of the things that we have in terms of discussions and so on, that too is on our website. So please go and look and become a member of KCOR. And if you're interested in, you could also just donate to KCOR if you don't want to necessarily become a member, but we would ask that you could donate to our cause and help us continue producing the kinds of programming that we have been able to do for you. So again, Phil, thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation that you've given us. And I look forward to more casual discussion and talk. Thank you.